Hello, that was the fourth movement, the Festen Opfertanz, from my first symphony, The Glass Bead Game, based on the novel by Hermann Hesse, and it's inspired me to come to the Marktplatz, the central market square in Weimar, just around the corner from the Bach Wall. However, the square predates Bach's era by a few hundred years. It was originally used from around the beginning of the 15th century as a courtyard for tournament festivals. I imagine there would have been a lot of horses and ale and boisterous cheering in those days. It was not circled by buildings, as it is now, for another 100 years or so. The building behind me is one of the originals, the Cranach House, so called because Lucas Cranach the Elder established his painting studio here in the middle of the 16th century. He worked here on the triptych that's now in the Herder parish church. One of the most beautiful buildings in the square is the Rathaus, the glorious town hall, which accommodates the offices of the mayor of Weimar. The building was added to the square shortly after Goethe's death, after the previous building was mostly destroyed by fire. I suppose it's a fairly new building in relative terms, but it has a neo-Gothic architectural style that fits well and seems completely compatible with the Weimar tradition. In honour of the town's musical heritage, there's a porcelain glockenspiel in the tower too, that sounds a delightful melody every hour. This is the Neptune fountain, dancing to some extraneous tune. It's a copy of an original created by Martin Gottlieb Klauer, the classical Weimar sculptor who also made the bust of Johann Gottfried Herder by the parish church. And yet with all your walls and dams, you're merely dancing to our tune, since you prepare for our Neptune, the water demon, one vast feast. You'll be lost in every way. The elements are ours today, and ruin comes on running feet. Also in the Marktplatz is the Elephant Hotel, originally constructed in the late 17th century and the locus of activity throughout the city's history. I'd like to take a brief look inside now, and also later in the episode. Given that my brief sojourn through the history of ideas has reached the Weimar Republic, and given I found my way at last to the Elephant, I should add that the list of influential figures who considered Weimar the spiritual heart of Germany includes the Chancellor of post-Weimar Republic Germany, Adolf Hitler. The first Nazi Party rally following his release from jail in 1925 was held in Weimar. The Nazi Party used the Elephant Hotel as their party headquarters thereafter, and Hitler was frequently here to review the ranks of marching troops from the balcony. After National Socialism won power in 1933, one of the first commands was to completely modernise and rebuild the hotel, such was its stature. In 1937, prisoners were used to level the old structure and several adjacent properties, and to erect the current building in its place. It's rather windy, but I've come to the Gau Forum in Weimar. It's a very pleasant building indeed. It's now used mostly as a government building, but it has an interesting past that I'd like to look at. These buildings were also constructed by Hitler. Some of the site had been parkland bordering the Grand Ducal Museum, but the Führer commissioned the construction of a Hall of the National Community and several bell towers. Rudolf Hess laid the foundation stone in 1937. Since reunification, the building has been renovated and repainted to make it less intimidating, not only given the austere architectural style, but also given its associations with a dark past. But back then, after the first blocks had been completed, the large courtyard in front of me was named the Adolf Hitler Square, and thereafter used to stage various mass rallies of many tens of thousands of both eager and conscripted participants. Furthermore, the building was envisaged as a template that could be recreated in other cities elsewhere in the country, including a massive version in Berlin, although the building plans were interrupted and eventually discarded during the ensuing World War. I want to be able to show more of the beautiful architecture in Weimar, and in particular the buildings around the market square. But given I've reached the Nazi era in the city's history, I've come somewhere less attractive. I've come to the old Gestapo Keller, which is only a few hundred metres from the Weimar castle. Following the rise to power of the Nazi Party, the Thuringian government had been quick to establish a secret state police to combat political dissidents, following the lead of Berlin and Munich. The protective arrest and deportation to concentration camps of political opponents had begun in earnest. The Weimar Gestapo was as meticulous in its wielding of terror, with recourse to brutal torture and forced confessions, as any other, and it used the Mirstel complex above me, which is now the Central State Archives of Thuringia, while waiting for the Gauforum buildings to be completed. The cellar down here was used for interrogations and for holding those condemned for execution, and as a bunker during the war years. Today we honour those who resisted the tyranny of that time. I've come to the Theaterplatz to view another plaque on the National Theatre building, this time in honour of Thomas Mann, who was outspoken against Nazism for many years and throughout the war, and who had close associations with the elephant, and furthermore, who was born within 2 years of Hermann Hesse. Both of these German novelists cultivated a deep allegiance to the profundities of their cultural heritage, including a strong interest in the work of Goethe, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and in matters pertaining to the human mind, including psychology, and in Hesse's case, psychoanalysis. Both men had been influential figures during the years of the Weimar Republic, before the rise of Nazism, and both were consequently awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. It was Hesse that aided Mann's flight into exile in 1933. Mann had visited Weimar and stayed at the Elephant Hotel on several occasions before circumstances necessitated his flight, and thereafter he chose it as a setting for his novel Lotte in Weimar. Consequently, when he visited the town again after the war to receive the Goethe Prize, and thereafter to donate the funds to the reconstruction of the Herder Church, as a part of the 200th birthday celebrations of the literary fellow's birth in 1949, he'd been disappointed to find the hotel closed to the public. It was being used to billet Russian soldiers. And so, after he moved to Kilchberg in Switzerland, which I'm very familiar with, having worked at the international school right on Lake Zurich myself, and when he was invited to Weimar again in 1955, just a few months before his death, he used his influence to persuade the authorities to open the hotel again, specifically so that he could stay in it, and it's still open today. Yes, they had romanced when the two of them were both in their youth, he and Charlotte, and thereafter, though the romance never came to anything, Goethe had narrated the entire story. The Sorrows of Young Werther had become one of the most popular and inspirational books of the Sturm und Drang era, and in turn attracted the attention of Duke Karl August and caused Goethe's invitation to Weimar. It was well known to Charlotte's friends and acquaintances that it was her who had inspired the famous novel, and she had lived with this all of her life. People had looked at her strangely and treated her differently as a result. She'd become the victim of his success. And now it was Thomas Mann telling the story of her return to Weimar to see him again more than 40 years later after their original encounter. In Lotte in Weimar, Mann examined Goethe's sentiments pertaining to his own self-worth. After all, in much the same way that I'm looking to Weimar as a spiritual heart, Thomas Mann looked to the same, and in particular to Goethe as a personification of German cultural achievement. But he also stepped back inside the hotel and examined the circumstances pertaining to Lotte. She waits in the foyer of the Elephant and imagines what it will be like when she meets him. She wants to settle some of the injustices done to her by events. She wants atonement for the sacrifices she was forced to endure as a result of his work of brilliance and his unexpected fame. She was made captive by events, but now she wants to be free. Then might one ask to know your yearning. It's something daring, I've no doubt, since the moon was near you in your journeying. Might it be moon madness you're about? Thomas Mann wrote other works that have been influential, including his early novella Death in Venice, which tells of the obsession of an elderly man for a young Ganymede-type Polish boy. But it's his post-war epic, written in 1947, that I'd like to consider now, Dr. Faustus. This novel also looks to Goethe and to the Weimar tradition as representative of all that's valued about German heritage. But it also responds to the refashioning of the elephant and the construction of the Gauforum and the Gestapo Keller, and all that these things symbolise. The novel retells a medieval legend set in the modern era, using the political turmoil of the period as a powerful backdrop. The protagonist, Adrian Leverkuhn, is a mediocre academic with aspirations to be a great composer who contracts syphilis intentionally with the intent of enhancing his artistic sensitivities by way of the encroaching sickness and madness. In metaphorical terms, he strikes a Faustian bargain with the devil, whereby he offers his soul in exchange for 24 years of genius. Thereafter, his musical output is remarkable, paralleling the achievements of Arnold Schoenberg, and the critical acclaim he receives is overwhelming. But as his mind deteriorates, he becomes obsessed with retribution and with the apocalypse and the Last Judgment. He experiences guilt and regret about his seeming betrayal of his friends, and he becomes convinced he was somehow responsible for the sudden and otherwise inexplicable death of his friend's child. At the last, he calls together his closest acquaintances for an after-dinner presentation of his new cantata, The Lamentation of Dr. Faust, so as to make a confession. He raves and babbles and discloses his demonic pact before eventually becoming completely incoherent and collapsing into irreversible madness. Leverkuhn's entire life, from cultural aspirations to final decline, unfolds not only in the context of, but in parallel with, the cultural and political environment which led to the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. The novel illustrates how the adoption of totalitarianism was itself a kind of pact with the devil that was inevitably going to lead to insanity and disaster. Yet there's also a sub-theme running through the book, implied by the symbolism of a Faustian pact. If the narrative states explicitly that when a person betrays the norms of goodness as defined by religious authority, there will be retribution, then implicitly there's an additional narrative whereby the revocation of agency embodied in the pact instigates a capitulation to a fate beyond personal control, to the necessity of destinism, of determinism. To offer up the soul is to renounce everything that makes a person a conscious and reflective being. Faust strips away human meaning and efficacy and leaves only a facade of semantics that reveals the emptiness underneath, the perfunctory mechanism. Without a soul, without agency, the human being becomes a human machine. And so it goes with Hermann Hesse. The Magister Ludi oversees the austere and secluded Castilian order, whose purpose is to play the supreme intellectual game able to synthesize different areas of knowledge, including the rational, empirical and aesthetic, in a way that reveals a profound semantic. Yet the Magister senses that while the order remains aloof from society, however refined the mental play, this withdrawal from the problems faced by humanity represents a renunciation of ethical responsibility, which in turn is a kind of Faustian bargain and loss of efficacy. And that by embracing this loss, there is only the futility of determinism. As a consequence of this ineptitude to exert agency, when he tries to help society in even the most meagre of ways, he's found profoundly lacking. Published after his death, according to the novel, the first of the Magister's novellas dealing with pertinent issues tells of a shaman whose magical power to summon the rain has failed. He realizes he has no control over nature. He's merely a puppet in a play staged by powers beyond his control. He cannot even perceive the world of his own volition. All he can do to reclaim his status as agent is to offer himself to sacrifice for the good of the tribe. And just as with Mann's Dr. Faustus and Hesse's Das Gasperlenspiel, so it goes with the Iphigenia myth, which confronts the matter of human efficacy straight on. Is there such a phenomena as free will? Setting aside the circumstances, the narrative, the solidity of the prison walls, does a person have the efficacy to choose between different courses, or is the choice predetermined? Is it possible to decide autonomously to inflict brutality upon political opponents? Or is the acting out of such behaviour an inevitable phenomena, not just in terms of social pressure, but in terms of the regulated state of the universe? This is a modern version of the dilemma faced by those battling for or against the Augustinian and Luther traditions, or for or against the mechanistic implications of Newtonian physics, or for or against the inescapable authority of evolutionary factors. Iphigenia is demanded as a human sacrifice by the Olympian gods to satisfy a celestial will that is incomprehensible and incontestable. She's innocent and blameless, yet even guiltlessness and incorruptibility does not exempt her from the indiscriminate whims of the deities. The gods want her blood, and she cannot escape her destiny. Her fate is determined by the authority that underpins the cosmos. Human society can try to come to terms with the inefficacy of individuals by way of religious ritual, yet still all people shall be required to fulfill a role in the cosmos that is established by a greater jurisdiction than them. But then Iphigenia takes a stand, as did the shaman, as did the Magister Ludi, as did Faust. She acts to repudiate this authority, not by refuting its almighty power, but by refuting its inescapability. She cannot be free of the contingency of her world. She cannot escape her imminent slaughter, but she can deny that this fate applies to all possible worlds. She denies the necessity of the circumstances. She does this by choosing to go to the altar voluntarily. She refutes the absolute authority of the cosmos around her simply by asserting the efficacy of her own free will. Following a metaphysical tradition that has continued for almost 3,000 years since her immolation at the altar, I should bring matters to the present and, for the sake of clarity, characterise 3 sides to the free will debate today. On the one hand, there is metaphysical libertarianism, which affirms human efficacy and the existence of agency and free will. Although this affirmation is justified by different people in different ways, some libertarians, including some theologians, justify free will by way of a supernatural realm, a realm beyond the physical, which has jurisdiction over the physical realm, while others argue for a physical indeterminism that, in contrast, doesn't require jettisoning physicalism. At the opposite extreme of the debate, dancing to Neptune's tune, and that of Mephistopheles, is hard determinism, which insists that free will is impossible. Human behaviour is a part of the natural world and at the mercy of causal factors. Given the unchangeable laws of nature and the unvarying behavioural attributes of electrons and protons and subatomic particles, there's only one outcome possible given any set of circumstances. Antecedents provide causally sufficient conditions for all ensuing events. Everything that happens does so as a result of what happened before. Human agency and the ability to change things in the world, even the intentional mental act of watching and listening to a recording like this, is merely an illusion. The third position comprises the previous 2 positions existing simultaneously. Compatibilism argues that free will is compatible with determinism, or to put it another way, the universe unfolds deterministically, but human agency and free will exist within the context of this determinism. John Searle at UC Berkeley called the latter position a cop-out. He said that it evades the problem. Knowing that we cannot know something cannot be settled by way of asserting both to be true. Given that it's impossible to demonstrate any one of these theories above the other, and most probably will always remain impossible, for those of us in Weimar, surrounded as we are by the betrayal of a heritage that stands both for the quest for new knowledge and also for virtue and reconciliation, and for those of us who are mortal earthlings, surrounded as we are by the tragedies and the horror of the contingent, there is no other option but to take responsibility, as Iphigenia did before. In respecting the aesthetic, we must also acknowledge the rational, the empirical, and the ethical. We have to assume human agency, and the compatibilist position at the very least. Standing here, to do otherwise will be another betrayal. I'll finish with another section from my first symphony. Thanks for listening.